just want to talk briefly about globalism and nationalism. Firstly, people are concerned that nationalism is taking on a fascist role. They're also worried about that from globalism. Can the two work and work together? And I think that, yes, they can. Now, when it comes to nationalism, in a lot of cases, there are things in a given country that bring it together or hold it together. It might be certain political and cultural ideas, people, situations. So in Canada, people like Mordecai Richler, Jean Chrétien, Adrienne Clarkson, Margaret Atwood, they would be associated with Canada. At one time, our railway was. These days, donuts still are, and they probably always be, as will maple syrup and poutine. And for most of the country, the longer, colder winters. And our indigenous art, for example, the group of seven, those are things that, in part, make Canada a bit different. Now, when it comes to globalism, I might not be politically a globalist, but culturally I sure am. And what do I mean? Well, the kind of food I like isn't really native to Canada. I prefer Asian food, food from India, and Chinese, Canadian food, which some would say isn't really Chinese, but I think it is Chinese if it's cooked by people and they use what's available. And they make it a certain way with certain sauces and so on, and family recipes. It can be authentically Chinese Canadian. And there's Vietnamese food, so I like those things. And I'm not eating donuts, maple syrup, and poutine all the time. I don't think most Canadians are really. Some like that stuff, and that's okay. And when it comes to music, a lot of the jazz and blues that I prefer tends to be American. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't like Canadian jazz influences like Diana Krall or Oscar Peterson, which, again, those are Canadian jazz influences. They're not American. But getting back to what I'm saying about American jazz and blues, that's the kind of music that I like. And I would say that blues and jazz and even rock music, it's global now, as are certain kinds of American food, especially fast food, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, those are global cultural influences. And just as ideas of democracy, which started in ancient Greece, well, how is that not a global phenomenon? It's spread around the world, whether you like it or not, or whether you think it functions as best it can or should. I tend to look at democracy, I think, as Churchill said, it's, what did he say? It's the worst kind of government until you compare it to all the others, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But democracy has tended to serve white privileged males the best and minorities the worst. But democracy, too, is a global phenomenon. I'm not saying it can't work a little better or a lot better than it has. It could. But that's a global cultural phenomenon. And a global cultural phenomenon used to take place, well, not phenomenon, but cultural intermixing that becomes a cultural phenomenon, used to take place on trade routes, spice trails, and in port cities. And now with the advent of global media and social media, you can't really say or expect that we're just going to exist by nationalism alone. It's not going to work, and it hasn't worked, and it won't work. Just like globalism alone, well, what is that going to be based on? It has to be based on some cultural intermixing.